Hey folks, Steve here. I want to hit a couple of special topics in this video, a sort of a intermission, I guess, between the other videos and scenarios, and I need to correct a few mistakes, or at least talk about the mistakes that I made, and whether or not they dramatically affected the scenarios as you watch them in the previous videos. So if you haven't watched any of those, then this video might make a lot less sense. I encourage you to go watch those. But if you like to take enjoyment in watching me repent for mistakes, then keep on watching anyway. A couple of things. So the King George's War scenario that we just finished, I realized I got something a little bit wrong. So I think at the time that it mattered, we had Shirley here, the French stack, obviously, navally invading. And he had a whole bunch of units. He had some regiments with them and a few other units. The precise composition doesn't matter for what I'm going to talk about. I had done the naval invasion, and they were fortified in the fort. You know, they were good to go, and the French invaded. Now, I did not succeed in taking it in one attack, and so the French had to retreat. Now, based on how I read the typhus rules, that still meant that the French, or both the French and the British, would have typhus. You only get the one typhus marker, so you're expected to make an extra or um, denote that some way. Because even if a unit, like once a unit with typhus is in a stack in a hex, then basically all those units have typhus. So when the French navally invaded, I interpreted that as now having to stay in the hex and giving typhus to the British and themselves, which is still true. They I believe, still should have given typhus to the British. But when the French did not take Louisbourg in combat, they had retreat. Now, I had them retreat to this hex right here, and you guys wouldn't be able to tell that explicitly in the video because that's not stuff that I showed directly. But I did show the French and the British units arrayed like this next to one another, and that's not really how it should have worked. So at the time, the French fleet, we'll put it right here in the Gulf of Maine, even though the Gulf of Maine is really like all of that. It's also this, so we'll just put that here for visibility's sake. What should have happened is that the French should have gone back to the fleet, and then on a future turn, or the next turn rather, we would have rolled for fleet availability. If the French fleet stayed, we could have rolled initiative for these units, whatever was left, including the leader at the time, because I don't think he had died yet. Maybe he had died, I'm not sure, from typhus. Um, if they passed, then they could have come back and attacked again. If they had to retreat, they'd go back to the fleet. If the unit fails to activate, then you have to pick up the units and put them in a port somewhere, a safe port. And in this case, it could have been Lumenburg. It could have been, was that Grand Prix? Could have been Grand Prix. It could have been, could have been over here. We had to have picked some other port. And given that, we're giving typhus to people, we probably would have picked something isolated. Um, and so uh, when the French bled away, they should have bled away somewhere else, probably, rather than right outside the gates of Louisbourg. Now, the reason why that didn't really matter for game purposes, for the most part, is that these British units still would have gotten typhus if I interpret the rule correctly. And I'll assume that I did here and say that like all those units in that same hex for the short amount of time they were all together fighting and whatnot, somebody sneezed in somebody's face and he got typhus, or something. I'm not an expert on typhus, so I don't know. Um, I maybe should go look it up before I start saying dumb stuff on camera. But it's entertainment for you guys, right? So these guys, what eventually happened to the British is that they all died. They all died from typhus, every single one of them. And the thing about Louisbourg is, it is a civilized hex that is default friendly to the French in this scenario. So when the French left, that's one thing. But when the British all died, Louisbourg was de facto French controlled because it is a French civilized hex area. Now, I eventually put a reinforcement in here for one spring to hold it, and that was fine, basically. And then I eventually moved these remnant uh, French regulars into here when really that would have required either maneuvering, ferrying, maneuvering, getting in here, which they probably wouldn't have had enough activations to do, or the French fleet needed to go in there. Now, the thing is, I had enough instances after this occurred over here where the French fleet was available on some turns that I could have done that, and it ended up wouldn't have mattering even if I didn't, because we never, we well, I guess it could have mattered, because the French, or I'm sorry, the British did have one last naval attempt on Louisbourg that failed because these units were there. Um, and I guess if they hadn't been, the British could have taken Louisbourg. Now, if the British had in fact taken Louisbourg again, they still would have won because they had control of Crown Point. So me trying to go for Louisbourg again at the end of the game was purely out of the interest to see if I could do it, and if the British had managed to do it with those provincials, then they might have won even more than they did. So that's kind of the net effect. So just something to watch out for. When some of these scenarios have special rules, it does increase the complexity of interpretation to get things right. But so yeah, so something important. It's just something you're going to want to watch out for if you're playing this game. And there are some Board Game Geek threads out there that cover this. But the same thing would have happened for if the British had failed to take Louisbourg the first time. To do a naval invasion, wherever you're going, you need a fleet in the sea zone adjacent to it. So in this case, to go to Louisbourg, the British need their fleet in the Gulf of Maine. You need to activate the leader and stack, or the individual independent stack of units that are going to go on the naval trip. You'll get them, you'll pick them up, you'll take them over, you'll have yourselves a fight. And then, again, if you're doing linear combat, you got to read this carefully. You can have multiple rounds of linear combat if there are still units left to keep fighting, but the attacker has to pass an initiative check. If you fail that initiative check, that is when you have to go back, and you go back onto the fleet as part of a retreat. That's the key sequence for amphibious invasions if the defender wins. Now, we've had a lot of cases so far playing the game where the amphibious invasions succeed, and you don't have to worry about the multiple rounds of combat, and you can get away kind of clean there. But again, if it's first round of combat ends, you go for a second round, but the attacking stack fails initiative, they have to retreat to the previous hex, or in the case of a naval invasion, they have to go back to the fleet on the next turn. If the fleet is still available and manages to stay here, then this stack can roll for initiative and try again. If they fail initiative, or the fleet is not available that next turn, then you're going to place these guys back into a friendly port. They don't just disappear and get eliminated unless you have no friendly port on the map, in which case then that's a problem. So just something to watch out for. I got it we'll say 80% right, but the 20% was really important that I got wrong. But ultimately, in the big scheme of things in the game, it didn't necessarily change who was going to win. And if the British had taken Louisbourg again, these were forces that were not up here anyway. That again, it wouldn't have changed who won. It might have changed the degree of victory. There's one other topic I'm going to address here, but I'm going to clean up the map a little bit before I do. Okay, hey guys, here's another role thing that I want to go over. First things first, before I get into this, I want to thank Tom Swider, who supports the game as a fan of the game on Consim World and Board Game Geek, and he's been doing this for a while now. He's been really polishing the Vassal module. Everything Tom does, he cares about, and he seems to want to make games better. Whether we're talking about games like End of Empire, he's also done things for Nations in Arms. And I regret that I no longer live in the same state as Tom. I feel like Tom and I would get along very well in playing games together and having similar interests. but Tom had reached out to me regarding the potential for me to have not gotten the supply rules correctly for King William's War and Queen Anne's War as it relates to the wilderness factoring and the lack of supply hexes and the reliance on overseas supply. Now, at first glance, I said, "Oh gosh, Tom must know better than me," and I'll assume I got it wrong. But I started looking at the rules again to just kind of sanity check myself, and I still think I did it right. But I want to talk it through here during this intermission video to try to get at least my thoughts organized as to why I think I'm still correct. So I put my my famous bingo chits back on the map to kind of help put us back into the mind set of the King William and Queen Anne War scenarios where we need to trace supply. So so the way that the rules normally work is that you have these supply hexes that you trace to, or in absence of those supply hexes, or just because it's easier, you trace overseas supply. Now, the way that the tracing of supply works in this game is not terribly complicated, but I want to call out some very specific verbiage that is used both in the original rules and uh, the Minuteman rules, the sort of living rules. So I want to show something here. So the North American supply units are in supply if they can trace a supply line to a friendly supply hex. If the unit is in a civilized hex, the supply line may be traced through two friendly civilized hexes. So you get like a little bit of extra trace slack in your path. If you're in friendly civilized territory, to a river, a navigable river, or a road hex. If the unit is in a wilderness hex, it must occupy the river or navigable river or road hex. And then the supply line is traced through any number of contiguous river, navigable river, and or road hexes to a friendly supply hex. And then there's a little marker, a note there in terms of clarification around ferry tracing, but that's not really important for what I care about for the moment. So just if we were looking back at this wilderness map scenario, again, I made the leap to say, hey guys, these supply hexes appear to almost always be in civilized hexes. So if we're going to say that these hexes with the green markers that I have here, or as the scenario stipulates, is wilderness, we shouldn't treat those as supply hexes. That makes supply too easy to achieve in areas that were very difficult to stay supplied because of the lack of infrastructure and depots and all of that. So, as it relates to the British and the French having supply in the Queen Anne and King William scenarios, all of a sudden, the British only have supply if traced to these areas down below if you're using North American supply. For the French, all of a sudden, they have none because even the one in Quebec is not present, or at least that's how I chose to adjudicate the rules. They say, oh man, supply is very tough. Well, then what else do you look at? Well, there's overseas supply. So I want to be really careful in terms of reading this through, but the main section that I'm concerned about here is the very first paragraph. Overseas supply is traced just like North American supply. This is the first key sentence in my interpretation of the rules. However, instead of tracing to a friendly supply hex, overseas supply is traced back, I'm putting the back in there, but this is what it's intending to say, I think. Overseas is traced to a port or a navigable river hex. If the hex traced to is an inland hex, meaning, basically any of these hexes that are on the major Hudson River hexes that are navigable and not, at Saratoga it switches over. If it's traced to an inland hex, the navigable river hexes between that hex and the coast must not be occupied by enemy artillery units or units with organic artillery. Now there's some notes here. Overseas supply cannot be traced to Philadelphia if the Delaware River is occupied by a unit with artillery. Lakes are treated like navigable rivers, so Lake Champlain is essentially a navigable river for this purpose. You can also trace overseas supply for units that are just straight up on the coast, and that's how I played it. So far, so good. And may not be used if it is traced to a coastal hex that borders on the sea area with an enemy fleet that's doing blockading. So, all makes sense to me. That's how I played it. And then we've got a few other special situations where all of a sudden you don't get access to overseas supply. But to me, what that means is, and this I think is what is the tricky part, to say, well, for the British, where are you tracing supply to, right? Where are you tracing supply to? Well, as it relates to the primary theater of those wars where supply is of concern, which is along the Lake Champlain axis, well, here's your port, right? I mean, you're effectively talking about, um, White Plains and New York, and in particular, I think for what it matters for the British, like, okay, they're going to trace supply from either the port of New York or their supply hex in White Plains. It almost doesn't matter either way, because assuming you don't have enemy artillery along the Hudson, you're going to trace supply to either New York or White Plains, however you want to look at it. It almost doesn't matter what type of supply you're tracing in this case, because it's going to go down the Hudson, it's going to get to Saratoga, because you keep tracing the same logic, right? You keep using roads and regular rivers. It comes up and over through the carries, and the rules talk about the Hudson Carry, uh, where it connects to Lake Champlain, and then that takes you up basically the St. Lawrence River line. And you're in supply. That is my interpretation of the rules. I don't see I made any sort of mistake as it relates to that. My main thing was making sure that the British basically don't get to use these other supply hexes in case it mattered. And I don't think it ever really did, because really the British units were either always against the coast or stuck to a river line that traced back to the coast, which again, like overseas supply, they could send supply up to here, right? The overseas supply tracing, which goes to either a navigable river that eventually goes to the coast or the coast itself, represents supplies that are being ferried through the port or from the sea, and is not dependent on all of a sudden a traffic jam occurring at a regular hex line, because you're still, the source of the supply is the coast effectively instead of a supply hex. That's the difference. In my reading, overseas supply does not stop at Saratoga, and I think that is some point of clarification I'll need to suss out with Tom. I think we interpret the rules a little bit differently there, but to me that seems very clear to me. Um, Very clear that that is how you trace supply. Now, for the French, the situation is a little bit different, and is in fact more difficult. So, in my campaigns, and I think this is what might have given some people the first pause, was that, okay, well, I had the French starting to move down here. Now, if overseas supply worked that way, where a normal river you can't pass overseas supply through for some reason, that would mean that right here is where the French lose their ability to push supply. But that, to me, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I don't think that's the right interpretation of this situation. What it does mean is that the overseas supply for the French is predicated on the St. Lawrence River coming into the port of Quebec. And so they are still, Quebec is technically still a port, even if it's a wilderness port. But the trick is going to be that because Montreal, Three Rivers, and Quebec are not supply hexes in and of themselves, the tracing of French supply is predicated on coming into Quebec and then tracing along the Lawrence, St. Lawrence River as navigable hexes. And if, for instance, the British or native tribes or whatever suddenly park on these two hexes, which are, or even this hex, so this hex, possibly this hex, anywhere where the navigable river becomes a regular river, then you could cut supply further down Lake Champlain, because that's where the bottleneck is. a normal unit with or without artillery will block supply through a wilderness hex on a regular river. So the French ability to navigate down here and be in supply, this is their weak point right here, and it can be cut, and it can be cut much more easily than you might think. But that's sort of the key part of this that I think matters. So so again, I interpret the rules to mean you can trace overseas supply from, with or without these supply hexes, though I think a lot of this is ending up being redundant anyway. The British could go trace supply from here to here to here to here to here to here, all being overseas supply, if that's how they wanted to interpret it. But even if there was a French fleet in the North Atlantic, New York is a supply hex, so I'm not sure it matters as much here. But you're going up, 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 up. They're going to, let's say they push the French back, they can trace all the way up to Lake Champlain. Let's say they've cleared out and have occupied Montreal, they can trace overseas supply to Montreal to here. And then they can be pushing up the St. Lawrence River. And maybe if they take Quebec, then, maybe they're able to trace supply in the whole circuit from New York, around, let's say they took Louisbourg all the way to Quebec and have a circle of supply effectively, as long as they stay on the river line. And to me, that makes sense, because if you didn't have that, it's just a very different supply calculation, to the point where it's almost like, I don't know. The logic just doesn't play out very well in my mind. For the French, it's especially bad. I think the British just, again, due to their ability to trace to other supply hexes in White Plains, where that's still pretty much okay. The main impact, I think, is more to the French, which all of a sudden, if you just said overseas supply can't exit a navigable hex, like, okay, well then they could never leave here effectively, or they can leave there before the winter, but they're not going to be able to hang out in some of these forts that were established for fairly good reasons. So I don't know, guys. I'm trying to have that conversation and try to weigh the interpretation of the rules. To me, the rules are clear in this case that you could have a British or a French unit sitting here in Crown Point and be an overseas supply, because you're tracing, free, assuming free of enemies, free of artillery, you can trace back to here, and that goes ultimately to a port on a sea zone, and that's supply. That's the supply you need to trace. Ultimately, this North American supply ends up just being so much more important for later scenarios, where you have more units, so it's more likely that some of these river lines are going to be cut off by your onesie twosie of enemy units, and it's just a very different situation. And in that case, yeah, it can matter whether or not you're tracing back to a supply hex versus overseas supply, especially when the Americans will not have access to overseas supply until the French enter. But I think I'm still good, guys. I don't know if other folks have been reading the rules and are playing these scenarios. Please let me know what your perspective is. I am okay if I'm ultimately wrong on this, but based on my reading of the rules, and I'm a policy procedure guy, right? I look at that and say, okay, if X, then Y, I think I'm still good. So, yeah, I don't know. Well, I'll let you guys know what I find out. One last thing I want to do with this intermission video, just because I can, and it's kind of interesting to compare. I've got the map cleaned up. I might as well show some interesting tidbits here. I wanted to show you guys the scale of how we're steadily increasing in complexity across all of these campaigns, as we're about to enter sort of the last couple that are really big and are going to take much more time to play. Here's the counter load for King William's War. Both sides in one baggie, nothing too crazy. Here's Queen Anne's War as well, going in chronological order, about the same. Nothing too, it's not a lot of stuff, it's a fair amount. Of course, Jenkins' Ear is a much smaller scenario. Here's all the counters you get from Paper Wars 86. You can see Some of these scenarios are, they're obviously bigger. They're representing whole wars. These are more zoomed in conflicts. Here is our King George's War counter sets. And this baggie used to have the Jenkins ear stuff in it, but I decided to take it out. That's why that says Spanish there. I decided to organize it a little bit differently. So King George's War, French and the British, a little bit bigger. Big enough that I wanted to separate them into two different bags. A fair number of counters. We had just finished this scenario in a previous video, and a fair number of counters, right? Like we had stuff strewn about the map. Well, then the next step up, which is going to be sort of the next big scenario that we look at, is just keep the factions in the same space. This is a kind of a thinner bag. This is a much thicker bag of counters for the French and Indian War. So we have, I think what I had done, when I first punched counters, I was thinking, oh, maybe I would separate all of these guys in individual bags, and so I created labels for them before bagging them, which was not the smart idea. So I have, this is the Tories and the Indians and the establishment provincials and the regulars, basically all of the British units for the French and Indian War in this bag. Same thing with the French here. So it's more robust than King George's War, and out of all of the previous scenarios, obviously the French and Indian War uses a fair bit more counters. There's just more stuff here. But now, let's look at how many counters in this game are dedicated to the American Revolutionary War. War of the American Revolution. Whoa! So we've got a whole bag for British regulars. A whole bag to itself of British regulars. We've got a bag for the Tories and provincials. We've got the French and the Spanish, their own little bag. We've got bags for the native agents and the units themselves. We've got the German mercenaries who get their own bag. And we've got this big, nasty bag of American units that are not organized at all. That's bad for me. And so there's just kind of a grab bag of everything. So it's a lot more. So it's like you look at how our rate of complexity changes. We've only just finished this. We're going into the French and Indian War, and then the American Revolution is going to be bonkers in terms of all the units on the map, all the withdrawals that we'll be doing on a regular basis. The game is going to go so much slower when we hit this scenario. It's going to be wild. This one, I feel like, it'll be robust, but it won't be too crazy. It will be a step up from King George's War. But we'll see how it goes, guys. So, yeah, there you go. I hope you enjoyed this little intermission video talking about some of the rules issues that I've run into, or at least rules conversations around supply, which, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right. But just some more fun stuff. A little intermission to break up the pace. We'll be headed into the war, the French and Indian War next, pretty soon. So see you in that one, guys.